Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is a lecture about the use of intertextuality in Alison Bechdel's graphic novel Fun Home, particularly with respect to her most important sources, the James Joyce novels Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Ulysses. The lecture assumes that you, the listener, have read Fun Home and are now ready for this analytical look at the novel. Before continuing with this video lecture, I ask the audience to do two preparatory tasks. Don't worry, neither will be as arduous as Ulysses' journey from Troy to his home, Ithaca. Task 1. Google James Joyce's name/work in order to acquire a sense of his work, especially with respect to his novels, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Ulysses. This should provide a basis for understanding both how these two novels work for Bechdel and my lecture on the subject. Task 2. Please take a look at the chart I have provided. It gives a sketch of their intertextuality I will be presenting. A little break here for you to do those, then I'll start again. The two Joyce novels provide a connection to a larger world of ideas and literary history through the technique of intertextuality. And we, the readers, get to do our own work in figuring out how Alison Bechdel has used Joyce's characters, narratives, etc., in her quest to make this a rich experience for us. In this sense, our encounter with the text should be intellectual fun, pun intended. This lecture will be in 5 parts. First, an introduction to the main themes. Second, an explication of Chapter 1. Third, a large Joycean themes look at Fun Home. Fourth, a final chapter of Fun Home. And fifth, a short conclusion. The story of Alison Bechdel's Fun Home is clearly her quest for an understanding of her father. I also want to make a case for the idea that a serious work of art, such as Fun Home, can also be about its own technique, its world, the connections it asks the reader to make. Fun Home is actually very deliberate with respect to demanding that we read it in this way. Each chapter title comes from a literary work that will be put into play during the chapter. The term we use for this is intertextuality. And while each of the works Bechdel employs is important, it is the novels Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Ulysses by James Joyce that dominate. James Joyce's novel Ulysses uses the Odyssey of Homer as a structural narrative and substantial foundation. Similarly, Alison Bechdel uses literary works, especially Joyce's novels Ulysses and Portrait. There are plenty of other smaller literary foundations as well, some of which are designated by the chapter names. They are not add-on or insubstantial in nature. They are fundamental to her novel. In Chapter 3, the narrator Alison herself states, "I employ these allusions to James and Fitzgerald not only as descriptive devices, but because my parents are most real to me in fictional terms." Only a literary person, such as Alison Bechdel, would see her parents as fictional literary characters. Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is titled Old Father, Old Artificer, a quotation from Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which immediately alerts the reader that Joyce's Portrait, a second novel, is here. Beginnings are often laden with import, and that is the case here, as we learn that this is a novel about the relationship between a child and father, Bechdel and her father, Bruce. The relationship between Alison and her father is compared to the relationship between Icarus and his father, Daedalus, from Greek mythology. See the chart. Bechdel is imitating and using the relationship in Portrait between the central character, Stephen Daedalus, and his father, which Joyce also compares to the very same mythological father-son pair, Daedalus and Icarus. In Portrait, Stephen Daedalus must square off not only against his biological father, but against other father figures as well, the Catholic Church and its priesthood. Stephen continues his search for a father figure in Joyce's next novel, Ulysses, finally finding him in the character Leopold Bloom. And one can take this father issue back one stage farther to the long-awaited reunion between Telemachus and his father, Odysseus, in the Odyssey. There are many layers of father-child here, and Bechdel will frequently refer to all of them. They are part of the backbone of the novel. On the first page, we have what are called Icarian games being played by Alison and her father as she flies by being lifted up by her father's legs and arms. In the next panel, Bechdel, the author, writes, considering the fate of Icarus after he flouted his father's advice and flew too close to the sun, his wings melted. Within that same panel, she writes, in our particular reenactment of this mythic relationship, it was not me, but my father, who was to plummet from the sky. We should suspect from this that Bechdel will be fluid with respect to which character corresponds to which character from her intertextual sources. Bechdel's father is referred to as Daedalus 5 times within the first 12 pages of the book, establishing this important mythological and literary engine in no uncertain terms right from the beginning. Joyce uses the Daedalus myth to construct his character, Stephen Daedalus, and Bechdel uses both the myth and Joyce's character, Stephen Daedalus. By using mythological figures as representations of her father, Bechdel creates a father figure rather than a real father who she truly knows, thus buttressing a central theme of the novel, Bechdel's desire to know her father. On page 6, she describes her father as an alchemist of appearance, a savant of the surface, a Daedalus of decor. Here, referencing mythological Daedalus as supreme inventor and artist, as well as Joyce's Stephen Daedalus as the wishful artist, obsessed with aesthetics, but producing almost nothing. I suggest that the father figure is also a slippery figure for us as the reader as well. I believe that Bechdel establishes this through an overabundance of literary references and characterizations, as her father fractionally dwells within works by Proust, Fitzgerald, and Wilde. We readers must put together the morass of partial characterizations from a plethora of literary sources mirroring Alison's efforts. Thus, we are in the same struggle as she. It works beautifully. And don't we all live our lives in what we like to call reality, as well as in our own imaginations with their own deep mythologies? By the end of the book, we will have reached a role reversal. Bruce Bechdel is once again the Icarus who flies too close to the sun and falls into the sea. But only now can we recognize Alison as Daedalus, the inventor-artist, as she has been autobiographically writing the very book we are reading. On page 11, the Greek myth is present in the phrase, he, Daedalus, blithely betrayed the king, for example, when the queen asked him to build her a cow disguise so she could seduce the white bull. This is the Minotaur story from Crete, an essential part of the Daedalus myth. On page 13, Bruce Bechdel suggests acquiring a gas chandelier, provoking his wife to respond, bordello, and whorehouse, which immediately places us into the Circe chapter of Ulysses, where Stephen Daedalus and Leopold Bloom visit a bordello or whorehouse, and Stephen has a pathetic encounter with a gas chandelier. Next, Alison's house is referred to as a maze, referencing the maze that the mythological Daedalus creates for the Minotaur. Page 22 of Fun Home is devoted to the experience of water sensations, as the young Alison is given a bath by her father. In Portrait, water is used throughout the novel, well established from the beginning, where boyhood Stephen observes with great detail the sound of water going down the drain and the nature of the two cocks that give hot or cold water. At this point, I want to reveal a few of the large Joycean themes and place them within Fun Home. 1. Just as Joyce references many other works in his Ulysses, so does Bechdel in her Fun Home. 2. At the end of Joyce's previous novel, Portrait of the Artist, Stephen Dedalus rejects his father, his home culture of Ireland, the Catholic religion that has imprisoned him, and decides to become an artist. Similarly, Alison Bechdel, both within and outside of Fun Home, comes to terms with a problematic father, rejects and frees herself from mainstream heterosexual identity and culture, and becomes an artist. 3. In Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus discovers a spiritual father who is a pariah in Irish Catholic Dublin. It is the Jew Leopold Bloom, who has learned to negotiate his hostile world by hiding his Jewish identity. Similarly, Bruce Bechdel, Alison's father, was forced by pervasive cultural norms to hide his true identity. 4. Alison eventually finds a way to see her father as a spiritual guide. In Ulysses, Stephen finally finds Leopold Bloom, his spiritual father. 5. Just as Stephen Dedalus in Portrait cannot show love to his family, neither can Bruce Bechdel. The most direct Joyce reference here is on page 19 of Fun Home, where several panels are devoted to the problem of showing affection. A particularly important detail of this is an inability to kiss one another in a familial way. Near the end of Portrait, this is a climactic moment also, as Stephen cannot bring himself to kiss his dying mother. 6. Stephen Dedalus is a poseur rather than a true artist. Bruce Bechdel's decorations to his house are all surface gestures. He makes nothing original. This is made most apparent on page 16, where Alison, as narrator, states, "I developed a contempt for useless ornament. What function was served by the scrolls, tassels, and bric-a-brac that infested our house?" A bit later, she calls them lies, a double comment, in that Stephen Dedalus lives a lie by pretending to be an artist, and her father lives a lie by pretending not to be gay. 7. There are many Joycean references spread throughout Fun Home, and here are the remaining important ones, in my estimation. Early in Portrait, the young boy Stephen Dedalus is told by his classmates that he has a queer name, as they say, an important detail since Alison will discover her own queer identity. In Stephen's house, growing up, there is a lot of arguing and fighting over Ireland's history and the church, just as Alison's house reeks of fights amongst her parents. The beatings her father gives Alison echo the beatings Stephen receives at school from the priests. Little phrases such as skillful artifice refer to the mythological Dedalus. The fact that the Bechdel family is Catholic relates to Portrait, where Catholicism plays a huge role. In chapter 1 of Portrait, Stephen's classmates engage in what they call smugging, their term for gay sexual experimentation. This connects to Bruce Bechdel's gay adventures. Bruce Bechdel's inability to leave the small world of his community is a mirror of Stephen's difficulty of relieving what he characterizes as the prisons of Dublin and Ireland, expressed best at the very end of Portrait. Just as Ulysses has graphic details, so does Fun Home, in both senses of the word in Fun Home. For example, both have a masturbation scene. The Ulysses scene takes place in the Nausicaa chapter, where Joyce uses language creatively to transmit the scene. Bechdel has the advantage of the graphic within her graphic novel, as she simply draws a young version of herself masturbating. Joyce is famous for his obsessive attention to descriptive detail. Bechdel has the advantage on him here in terms of resources. She uses both language and visual art. The final chapter of Fun Home. Traditional heroism is deflated in Joyce's Ulysses. Perhaps the most powerful relation between Joyce's novel and Homer's Odyssey is this critique of traditional male heroism. In the Odyssey, it is valorized. In Joyce's Ulysses, it is rejected as it is replaced with the everyday human heroism of Leopold Bloom. Similarly, the last chapter of Fun Home, titled The Anti-Hero's Journey, is a reference to Bloom as the anti-hero of Ulysses. It presents Bruce Bechdel's gay world in both a glamorous, surface-oriented style and in a deflated, anti-glamorous style. This is accomplished through an actual journey within Fun Home when Bruce takes his family for a stay in the Soho district of New York City when Alison is 15. They had done this before, however, this time, Alison sees everything from a new perspective. On page 190, we see a group of gay guys hanging out on the street in a non-attractive manner. And now we are to see the artificial aspects of this culture, which surely remind Alison of the artificial nature of her father's life. The men wear tight pants that show genital bulges. A pair of guys are dressed identically. The glamour is presented through seeing Baryshnikov perform in a ballet and attending a performance of A Chorus Line on Broadway, a work with gay content. There is family panic as Alison's young brother John wanders off on his own, which introduces to Alison the chicken hawk phenomenon. We're told that chicken hawks are guys who prey on young boys, and this neighborhood will surely have this potential. And indeed, John is approached by one who invites John to go to his boat with him. There are references to the AIDS crisis, including the author's comment that this is a narrative of injustice, of sexual shame and fear, of life considered expendable. This attention to the details is also found in Joyce's Ulysses, where Joyce is not afraid to show the dark underbelly of things as they really are. In the last chapter, starting on page 196, Alison shares a deep reflection about her father. She retrospectively observes the close connection that she had with her father through literature that began when she was in his English class. This eventually leads to a scene wherein she briefly discusses the two Joyce novels on the phone with her father. On page 201, she chooses a course on Ulysses. A nice combination of themes is created here. In a single panel, we have 1, an English professor asking Alison why she wants to read Ulysses. 2, Alison stating that she, quote, really liked A Portrait of the Artist. And 3, commentary at the top of the panel referring to the Odyssey, stating, like the goddess Athena's visit to Telemachus when she nudged him to go find a long-lost dad, Odysseus. In the next panel, we learn that Ulysses is her father's favorite book. 2 panels later, with copies of Homer's Odyssey prominently depicted in the foreground, she narrates, I embarked that day on an Odyssey, which, consisting as it did in a gradual, episodic, and inevitable convergence with my abstracted father, was very nearly as epic as the original. Wow, what a sentence. If we were pursuing the shortest and most powerful version of what this entire book is about, that sentence would be an excellent choice. It's Alison's life at this stage, it's a large-scale description of the Odyssey, and it's Joyce's version of this in Ulysses, all applied to Alison's own life. Pages 206 and 207 continue with more Ulysses content. The detail is wonderful, including things that a graphic novel is ideally suited to express. For example, the first page of Ulysses is presented on page 206 with extremely large first letter of the first word of the novel, stately. This is exactly how it appears in the first publication of Ulysses. When Alison learns on page 206 that Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom are exiles, I think we should presume that she relates to this as a lesbian. On page 207, when Alison diverges from this Joycean material and she dives back into her own lesbian literature, she still cannot escape the Joycean. She calls this my own Odyssey. She narrates, one siren led to another, referencing the siren chapter of Ulysses. She again narrates, as perhaps the sea-ravaged Odysseus had in the ministration of Nausicaa. She even includes the very name of the Ulysses character in the Nausicaa chapter, Gertie McDowell, as Alison masturbates along with this narrative, just as Leopold Bloom does in the Ulysses Nautica. More Ulysses material follows on page 208, as Dublin's Catholicism is connected to that of the Bechdel family. And on it goes, through page 208 through 211. On page 211, Bechdel wittily dives back into the water leitmotif, as there are 6 water references within one panel: unmoored, broadside, swamped by my small craft, merchant marine, and Handel Wassermusik. The convoluted language on page 212 is an imitation of similarly convoluted language found in the Catechism chapter of Ulysses, titled Ithaca. On page 213, we find the water leitmotif continued within the Odyssey imitative narration. Quote, I was adrift on the high seas, but my course was becoming clear. It lay between the Scylla of my peers and the swirling, sucking Charybdis of my family. Scylla and Charybdis are taken from the Odyssey. This theme continues through the next several panels, which visually depict Alison's sexual activity. The narration reads, quote, veering towards Scylla seemed the safer route, and after navigating the passage, I soon washed up, a bit stunned, on a new shore. By choosing Scylla, which she has defined as her peers, Alison veers into lesbianism with her peer, Joan. The moist references here connect nicely with the oral sex graphically presented. More Odyssey material follows, including a reference to heroism, a theme that Joyce satirizes with his anti-hero hero, Leopold Bloom. One of the wittiest moments of Fun Home occurs on page 214, where the narration states, yet while Odysseus schemed desperately to escape Polyphemus's cave, I found that I was quite content to stay here forever. Here, Alison is graphically, deeply exploring the sexual cave of her partner, Joan. The narration tells us that Joan has a glass eye, making her a bona fide Cyclops, a reference to the one-eyed Cyclops Polyphemus is in Homer's Odyssey. And there is that beautiful line on page 216, quote, like Odysseus's faithful Penelope, my mother had kept the household going for 20 years with a more or less absent husband. In the Odyssey, this is indeed what occurs, as Odysseus is away from home for 20 years. On page 217, quote, the Irons called Alison to write a required paper. On pages 220 to 221, Alison and her father are alone in the car. It's a moment that is very much like the critical scene in Ulysses between Stephen and Bloom. Bechdel confirms this near the end of the scene as she narrates, quote, it was not the sobbing, joyous reunion of Odysseus and Telemachus. It was more like fatherless Stephen and sonless Bloom having their equivocal late-night cocoa at 7 Eccles Street. At the bottom of page 222, the panel has an excerpt from the Ithaca chapter of Ulysses as the narration states, quote, we had our Ithaca moment. Then Bruce takes his daughter to a world of a gay bar, more of his world, where Bechdel narrates, this might have been our Circe chapter, like when Stephen and Bloom drink at the brothel in Nighttown. On page 224, Bruce's gift of the book by Colette is referred to as a Trojan horse, referencing the Trojan horse strategy of the Greek myth that produced the Odyssey. On page 226, the funeral scene in Ulysses is presented, both in the narration and using the Joyce text to fill a panel. Here we are reminded that Bloom's father committed suicide, just as Bruce Bechdel probably did. At the bottom of page 227, we see a courtship letter from Bruce to Helen, where he favorably compares Helen's writing to Joyce. Page 228 is a single panel wherein the final lines of Ulysses fill the entire panel. The narration rectangles within the panel contain questions about Bruce's behavior in the context of Ulysses. Page 229 begins with a description of the modern library edition of Ulysses. We also find a panel with a drawing of Joyce standing in front of the bookstore Shakespeare and Company. Its owner, Sylvia Beach, published Ulysses in 1922. We learn that Beach was a lesbian. On page 230, an excerpt of one of Bruce's letters contains the line, quote, "I'm not a hero," surely a reference to the anti-hero notion of Leopold Bloom. And in the next panel, it is also compared to Stephen Dedalus' line at the beginning of Ulysses, "I'm not a hero." There are more details about the publishing of Ulysses that follow, and we learn that Joyce's children did not fare well. One went mad, another was an alcoholic. And we have the line, "The book's theme, that spiritual, not consubstantial paternity, is the most important thing." Here a reference to Stephen Dedalus and Bloom, as we note that Stephen left his biological father and went searching for a spiritual father, finding that father in the person of Leopold Bloom. I recognize how complicated this explication of the final chapter has been. It is dizzying, and that is how it comes at us as readers of Fun Home. The amount of Joycean detail is intimidating. How does Bechdel manage to connect so intensely with Joyce and at the same time maintain the sense of Alison's own autobiographical narrative? This was not an easy book to write. After writing Ulysses, Joyce correctly predicted that his writing would, quote, "keep professors busy for centuries." And yet another parallel with Joyce, Alison Bechdel, has given us a novel with deep intertextuality that invites similar literary explorations. And now, armed with our new knowledge of Joyce's presence in the book, let's probe the title of the book as we conclude. Fun. There's about as much fun in Alison's home growing up as there is in Stephen Dedalus's. Bechdel's book is witty, much like its most important model, Joyce's Ulysses. And home. The mythological Daedalus must leave his home, escaping from King Minos and Crete, where he was imprisoned within his own labyrinth. Stephen Dedalus must escape from his home, Dublin, as well. Joyce did escape from his home, Dublin, to continental Europe. In Ulysses, Leopold Bloom's Odyssey, is a one-day journey through Dublin, always fondly anticipating a return to his home. At the end, he indeed returns home to his marriage bed, knowing that his wife Molly has had sex in their bed with another man earlier that day. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus has spent 10 years in the Trojan War and now requires another 10 years to reach his home, Ithaca. Has his wife Penelope been faithful to him? Upon their reunion, there is much ado about their marriage bed, which Odysseus built. Fun Home presents us with a home wherein Fun Home presents us with a home wherein her father tortures family members with his obsessive decorating and with corporal punishment when homely duties are not completed to his satisfaction. Like her literary predecessors, Alison must escape from this home and yet still retrospectively create a sense of familial connection with a gay father she believes committed suicide. Her search for this spiritual connection is realized through literature, through the writing of Fun Home, and through the creation of connections with other characters, most of them Joycean. Her journey is parallel in some respects with the travails of Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses, as he searches for a spiritual father that is realized in Leopold Bloom. It is also a reflection of Bloom's journey back to his home in Ulysses. Home is pervasive in all these stories. So thank you for listening to this. I hope I've given you some stimulating ways to engage with this extraordinary work. Thank you.